Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to the 8th Annual Distinguished Faculty Lecture. I want you to know that at the end of a long day, there is nothing I would rather hear more than an actual academic lecture. I'm so excited. I really miss it, so this is going to be a treat for me, as it will be for all of you. So as you know, we're here today to hear presentations from 4 of our most impressive faculty members who earned the 2018 Chancellor's Awards for Distinguished Scholarship, Teaching, and Service. And these awards are given at commencement each year. So I got a chance just at the very beginning of my tenure with you to see all of them receive this award at graduation. And it is given every year in recognition of our honorees' excellence in the classroom, their achievements in their respective fields, and their commitment to this university, especially to the students and to our community. This is my first time attending this event, so I'm really eager to hear from all of our awardees and learn more about the work that they do for UMass Boston. If you know or have worked with Professors Julie Nelson, Shoshanna Ehrlich, Ellen Douglas, and Paul Kirshen, you probably have a good idea already of what you're going to hear about. This afternoon, each of them is going to present on the topic of their choice in accordance with the theme, Reflections from Distinguished Faculty. Julie Nelson has chosen the title of her talk to be Economics for Humans, which is based on the title of the book she's just published. Congratulations. And the bookstore will have some copies of the book. I believe they're right out there for those who want to buy a copy and get Julie's signature. Professor Shoshanna Ehrlich will provide a lecture on listening to student voices, creating multiple opportunities for impactful engagement in the classroom and elsewhere. And Ellen Douglas and Paul Kirshen will talk about dealing with the realities of climate change in Metro Boston. All of these faculty members, whom Emily will introduce in more detail, offer very special contributions that are really critical to UMass Boston's ability to fulfill its mission. As we are fond of saying, the public research university, it continues to lead in all of these areas, in research, in teaching, and in service. And these faculty members embody the very best of what all of you do. So I want to take this opportunity to extend my thanks to you and to congratulate you on these incredibly worthy nominations. It's the committee that made this decision. It's not an easy thing for them to select from among their peers, but they did a great job. I also would like to thank our colleagues Joanne Riley and Mary Roser from the University Libraries. Where are you? There you are. Hello. Because they planned this event, and this is really their tradition, so we appreciate that very much. It's consistent with the library as the beating heart of any university. It also offers an opportunity for us to appreciate one another, and we can never probably do enough of that. So thank you very much for taking all the time that you have taken to prepare for this and to join us. And now I bring you my colleague, Emily McDermott.
Well, I want to second what Catherine said. It's such a delight at the end of a day to come and remind myself that I'm an academic at heart, and by training and by inclination, and to be able to listen to my wonderful colleagues tell me about their work. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Chancellor Newman, for your remarks. I'm pleased to present to you today the esteemed faculty members who were selected to receive the Chancellor's Awards for Distinguished Scholarship, Teaching, and Service. Julie Nelson, Professor of Economics, is the recipient of the Chancellor's Award for Distinguished Scholarship. A pioneer and leader in feminist approaches that challenge older orthodoxies in the field of economics, Professor Nelson has developed a body of work that is extensive, interdisciplinary, and full of impact. She has published 9 books, three as the single author, 61 journal articles, and 29 book chapters. Her work has been cited more than 6,000 times and recognized with honors and awards, including the Thomas F. Devine S.J. Award for lifetime contributions and from the Association of Social Economics. She serves on 3 editorial boards and is the president-elect of the Association of Social Economics. Shoshanna Ehrlich, Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, is the recipient of the Chancellor's Award for Distinguished Teaching. Professor Shoshanna Ehrlich applies many years of expertise as an attorney, feminist legal scholar, and educator to her dynamic classroom learning environment. Her commitment to student-centered learning is evident in her rigorous critical analysis of course materials and assignments that intellectually empower students. Her teaching is concentrated in introductory and intermediate courses that are known for innovative and engaging assignments. In course evaluations, Professor Ehrlich is commended for being attentive, encouraging, and available outside the classroom. And from my days back when I was the dean of CLA, I can attest that her students really just overwhelmingly support her and recommend her, and I remember engaging in a lot of conversations that were totally centered on student success, and I'm happy to see you get this recognition, Shoshanna. Ellen Douglas, Professor of Hydrology, and Paul Kirshen, Professor of Climate Adaptation, are the recipients of the Chancellor's Award for Distinguished Service. For the first time in the history of Chancellor's Awards, the Service Award has been given to a team of professors. As prolific researchers of climate change, they undertook an ambitious public education campaign to increase awareness about the vulnerability of Boston's infrastructure, facilities, landmarks, and communities, and the steps necessary to reduce these risks. Very timely. I'm worried to hear what you're going to say. They have a deep conviction that climate change science and education are the fundamental underpinnings to the prudent and rational decision-making that is necessary to address the global environment policy crisis. Their work as a team exemplifies ways that members of the university community can improve the public good by integrating research and service. So first, I'd like to call Julie Nelson up to speak.
Thank you for those introductions. The devil comes and visits an economist and proposes a deal. Devil says, I will make you a tenured full professor at age 32. If you want to be a president's Council of Economic Advisors, head of the Federal Reserve, sure, not a problem. Nobel Prize or the Economics Prize in honor of Arthur Nobel, we can do that. Whatever you want, money, prestige, status, you've got it. All I ask is that in return, you, your spouse, your children, and your children's children burn in hell for all eternity. Economist thinks about it for a few minutes and says, so what's the catch? So that kind of goes with the reputation that economists have in some areas. It's a joke, and it's not quite entirely a joke, which is what makes it funny. Most economists, as my colleagues in the back row, are actually nice people in person. But there are some things that we have adopted as our professional standards that I believe have been quite perverse, and I've spent a lot of my career pointing these out and talking about them. So I wrote in the book, which the publisher got here on time, it was supposed to be out in September, just made it here. I wrote a little bit about what I had discovered in doing sort of a immersive ethnography of the economics profession. And what I saw as the sort of underlying belief structure were the following. We are rigorous and scientific. We make tough assumptions that people are self-interested and calculating. We see people as autonomous, independent, and rational. We use precise math. We study markets and perhaps industry and government. We describe mechanisms. We aren't touchy-feely and humanistic. We don't make that sentimental assumption that people care about each other. We reject the idea that people could be connected, dependent, or emotional. We don't use vague verbal arguments. We don't study family life. We don't deal with human relations or ethics. And I kind of summarize, I put these in two columns in the book, summarized at the bottom. We're macho guys. We're not soft, effeminate scholars like those sociologists and humanists downstairs. I don't know if you caught this, but at one point when Larry Summers, the economist, was heading up Harvard, he was quoted in the Globe as saying, sociologists just aren't as smart as economists. And I think he said what a lot of economists, my present company accepted. I'm in a very interesting pluralistic department here. But a lot of mainstream economists have this idea that the more math it is, the more scientific. So in my career since this discovery of the underlying value systems of my profession, I've taken this 4 different ways, which I'm just going to talk about briefly. Keeping an academic to 15 minutes is the hard part of creating this talk today. I could talk forever, of course. But the first of the 4 consequences I explored of this was looking how unscientific economists tend to be. That is, I looked back into history and philosophy of science. What is it that makes findings reliable? Objective, true might be a little bit too strong, but at least what makes them reliable? And what I discovered was that the economist belief system comes out of a belief that Newtonian physics is the epitome of science. And if we just did everything like that with theorems, proof, and calculus, we would get to objectivity. And that has since turned into a dogma. And I would argue that dogma is the opposite of science. So we have this illusion of detachment, that somehow the more mathematical we are, the less our own opinions come in. My previous book right before this from last year was looking at how economists looked at gender and preferences about risk. And not surprisingly, in my mind, they tend to find in the data exactly what they were looking for, even if it requires manipulating in the process and way over-interpreting. So the math does not protect us from our own biases. We really need a social nature of science, replications, feedback, in order to find out if our knowledge is reliable. And have open-minded systematic investigation. I'm afraid economists in the mainstream have invented a hammer and go around believing that everything looks like a nail and have to beat on it with that. This did not make me very popular in my early years. As an economist, my career has traveled around a little bit. It's been nice to get some recognition here, even if I don't from my profession as a whole. The other thing that I noticed in this set of values and assumptions, the idea that economists are about studying markets and maybe businesses or industry and government. The aspects of life traditionally associated with women have long been quite neglected. Household production has still not included in gross domestic product figures anywhere, in spite of a debate going on about that for decades. There's a whole area of caring labor, both paid and unpaid, that I've worked on as well. Unpaid caring labor, again, nobody notices that it's really work. Paid caring labor tends to be very low paid. Childcare workers in the US are usually putting neck and neck with parking lot attendants for median wage. So you get as much for watching a parked car as you do for bringing up the next generation. And a number of different assumptions come behind that. Also, carefulness versus risk-taking. This thing I just did about gender and risk was finding that stereotypes that women are more careful and men are more risk-taking actually drives a lot of spurious findings. But also, if you think of attitudes and say the financial crisis and this sort of thing, I don't think having layman sisters instead of layman brothers would have changed things. But I think if there'd been layman brothers and sisters for a long time, there may have been less of a macho atmosphere. A lot of the social psych studies, when you get the guys together, it often accentuates those sorts of stereotyped behaviors. So it's not that women bring something different, but we do have different cultural expectations that we carry along in different kinds of groups. So about the science aspects of it, the aspects of life traditionally associated with women. And then I got thinking about when we actually look at things like markets and businesses and governments. If we look at it only through the usual lens, which is all this, the kind of macho side, we leave out what we might consider to be the feminine associated or feminine stereotype aspects of business and economic life. This idea that's all entirely impersonal, for example. There's some stuff that we don't really need language and communication. It's all just dictated by money. If so, why are there so darn many business meetings? Okay, why do people still need to talk to each other? One of the most detrimental parts of this is the popularization of the economist-invented belief that business firms are entirely about profit maximization. That wasn't invented by business leaders. Business leaders thought about employment. They thought, often think about impact on society, other things. But economists came out with this doctrine because you can express it in calculus. And of course, we really like calculus. And it has caught on because it is so simplistic that it gets out there. It's not in the law. It's not in the tradition of business. It was invented by economists, which has led to some interesting contrasts between how economists do treat work done by women when they finally recognize it, and how they treat the work in what they consider the usual self-interested, calculating, autonomous economy. There is a very famous article that talks about how do you get a CEO of a firm to act in the interest of shareholders. If they're supposed to be profit maximizing, okay, but we also assume they're self-interested, so they must really just want everything for themselves. You can't expect somebody paid a lot of money to just show up and do a good job, right? I mean, that would be totally unrealistic if everybody's totally self-interested. So therefore, you must incentivize them with a lot of bonuses. You know, that 1% pulling away from the other 99%, a lot of it comes out of that. You have to incentivize with bonuses those CEOs to act in someone else's interest. There's also literature on nurses. There have been at least 2 articles published in reasonably respectable economics articles that say the way to get good nurses is to pay them less. That way you make sure that only altruists take the job. Yeah, really. It's that bad, okay? And you think this might have something to do with the gender wage gap when the reasoning is going in those directions. And the last one I want to talk about, and this will feed into our service lecture as well, is talked about attitude toward the environment. And this is where this book I've got now is a 2nd edition. I've added a chapter on environment there, and especially on climate change. The traditional way to address the issue of climate change within economics is to imagine that there is a social planner for the entire world who has to put the way to address climate change into a single optimization problem. That is, they're going to figure out the right path of carbon reduction to get to the level of carbon that's going to optimize worldwide well-being. They put a lot of interesting assumptions in there. I won't list them all, but one of them is that GDP growth will continue in an unlimited fashion. This means, therefore, that future generations are actually going to be richer than we are. So why should we sacrifice now for those rich folks? And besides, they'll have better technology because we assume this autonomous technology improvement. And so we really don't have to do very much. That's changing a little bit. Recent storms in the recent IPCC report, one of the people who had advised a slow ramping up is finally getting panicked and seeing that there's some problems with this. If we started out with the question, not what should the optimal planner do with these assumptions. If we started out with the question, what kind of world do we want to live in, we'd be in a different spot. And economists can say some useful things about use of markets and taxes and the rest, but don't trust economists to do the whole ethical global problem. Very bad idea. And I think I might leave an extra minute for the next people, because I'm just going to conclude by saying that while this sort of macho economics is still very popular in a lot of the profession, I think that economics should be done for and by human beings. It is not that I am against the math that economists use. I use a lot of it myself. It's a good skill. I just don't think it should be taking over. And instead of walking around with a hammer looking for a nail, we should look at what's in front of us and then figure out how best we can address those things. There it is.
Hi. So I want to start by thanking my department for all of their support and encouragement and wisdom, and also my husband I've learned a lot about teaching from. And I particularly want to thank Alora Chowdhury, our department chair, and Brittany Downey, our office head of everything, for all they did to sort of put this forward and their faith and trust in me. So putting together my talk for today, I actually had some panic. And then I'm like, wow, this is what the glazed over look I see when my students come into the office. And it was like a very humbling reminder of what they experience on a regular basis. What do I have to say? How do I make sense out of my experience, or for them more what I've read? How do I present it in a way that's legible to others? What do I bring to it? Where's my voice? What will others or my professor think of me? And in thinking about that and having that moment of connection with my students, I really began to think about what an incredibly humbling experience being a teacher is. And that the questions one needs to sort of ask to oneself continually to stay vital, to stay engaged, the willingness to confront both the limits of one's own knowledge and the limits of one's capacity to translate material to your students in a way that's vital, meaningful, transformative for them. And I'm sure we've all had that experience of coming in thinking you have something incredibly exciting and your students just sit there and they're like, oh, please get me out of there here. And how do you figure out how to move beyond that? And I think teaching here at UMB is humbling for two particular reasons. One is I am in continuous awe of my colleagues' commitment to teaching and how important being a good and caring and transformative teacher is, and that I'm surrounded by a community who really cares about teaching in a deep and authentic way. And the second, for me, what's always humbling and it's always a reminder that I try to keep coming back to is what our students are juggling in their lives. And so from the student who last semester, I'm sort of like, it might be, I said this privately to him, not in class, is it possible that you could try not to fall asleep in class? And he was like, I deliver pizza for Domino's to 3 o'clock in the morning. And I get home at 4 and I'm in school at 8 o'clock in the morning. And so I'm like, okay. What am I going to do? How can you tell someone like that they can't sleep? Or the student who has to rush home right after school because she's caring for younger siblings. The student who at one point, she announced at the end of a late day class that she could finally go home after a 48-hour awake shift in a juvenile residence center. And I'm like, great, you can get to sleep now. And she looked at me and said, sleep? I haven't seen my kids in 3 days. Or all of our many students who are juggling working full time, with kids, with a full student load. And so for me, it's this complexity of our students' lives that keeps me particularly humbled as a teacher and raises over and over, I think, the question, I've been here a long time, that just sort of haunts me. And I hope you don't take my award away because I have the question, not the answer. Put a runner-up in or something. Because the question is, how do I hold my students to a high standard, inspire them to believe in themselves as powerful learners, while also recognizing and honoring the complex realities of their lives? And so those are sort of my framing thoughts as I began to think about what I wanted to say. And then I wanted to think, and then I was saying, well, where does this come from in me, my commitment to working with students, and particularly the kinds of students we have here? And I realized, and share a little bit of background about myself. So I grew up with 2 college-educated parents, middle-class community. Going to college was the norm. And it was just part of who I was. I rebelled a little bit in my choice of colleges, but I didn't go stray too far off the beaten path. But my mother's story was very different. And she grew up in an immigrant family that was impoverished and against the backdrop of the Holocaust, where any extra money was sent to try to get family out of Europe. And her parents were literate, but they certainly were not college educated. And they had no expectation, because their lives were so chaotic, that their kids would go to college. And so much of my mother's childhood was really spent floundering in this very chaotic family environment, which included sending the kids to orphanages because her parents couldn't manage and didn't have money to provide for them. And in middle school, there was a teacher who saw something special in her and recognized this passion, this spark, and really nurtured her and took the time to support her in a way that no one else had done so. And eventually, my mom ended up getting a 4-year scholarship to college. She got on a train from San Antonio. You can ask me later how an Orthodox Jewish family ended up in San Antonio. Says something about the chaos. But in any event, got on a train at age 17 to an elite all-girls school on the East Coast, and essentially never went home again. And I had always assumed that her parents were like really proud and supportive. And I learned as an adult that they actually weren't. They did not understand why she had to do this and why she couldn't stay living in San Antonio, maybe going to community college and helping them provide for the younger kids. And so there she was in a university, probably most of the students were wealthy, came from totally different backgrounds, and she was completely overwhelmed and lost at times, but somehow this sense of passion and a belief in her that someone else helped nurture really got her through. And I think for me, I grew up with these stories and a deep sense of awareness of the transformative power of education. And I think particularly for folks like my mother, for whom this was not part of their narrative, this was not part of their story. And so I think that for me is what's so meaningful to me as teaching here. And so sort of with that sense of inspiration and commitment, I began to think, well, what is it that's central to my teaching? What do I bring that is sort of the hallmark of what matters to me? And other people, obviously everyone has their own teaching style. This is for me. I'm not saying this is the end all and be all of how to be a good teacher at all. But for me, and I have a bunch of bullet points, is I think maybe at the center is my willingness to always meet students at least halfway. And that even if they haven't done their work, they haven't come to class, their work is a mess, kind of, a page as opposed to an 8-page paper, whatever it is, that as students come and talk to me, I am always willing to believe them as to why, as to what they're struggling. My TA always tells me I'm get taken advantage of. And my attitude is I would rather occasionally have someone make up something and believe them, and I believe them, but know that listening to students and understanding and honoring that their lives are complex and sometimes schoolwork just cannot be done or classes can't be attended to due to that kind of chaos that many of the balancing. And so that for me has been really central. The other thing for me in my approach and thinking about this is I try to make really clear over and over and over that you don't have to be right in the classroom. And that if your answers are wrong, if they're partial, if they're stammering, if they're halting, it's fine. It gives us something to work with. And we can work as a learning community with the pieces of knowledge that each person can contribute, and that we can create something together as a community of learners, with the caveat that it has to have some connection to what we're supposed to be talking about in class. And that I'm also willing to listen to student silence. And by that, I mean, I give extra credit points for participation. I do not build it in as part of how I grade. Because although I do everything I can to encourage participation, I know that for some students it is too painful, it is too difficult, and makes them so anxious. And so I try to create opportunities and incentive through. It's one of multiple extra credit, but not a requirement. Although, again, the caveat, I almost always have some kind of group project that does require participation in front of the class. I know lots of people this doesn't work, but I make myself, except when I'm really on vacation, I'm on email all the time. And my students know that, and I feel like it's also another way that for me, I can recognize their lives don't happen between 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, and that I try to respond, I sort of, as soon as I get an email, regardless of when it is. Another is that, just a couple of other things, is I never base my grading on like 2 or 3 high stakes exams or papers, but try to recognize that students have different strengths, they have different ways of learning, of knowing, and to build in multiple opportunities, multiple ways of demonstrating knowledge. So the student who can't really put together a formal paper, I'm just now in my class now, I'm getting some of these brilliant double entry journals that are thoughtful, that are insightful, but the same student with a formal essay is struggling. So to try to create, and nothing's ever worth more than 20%, so that it's spread out over and based on different kinds of learning and knowledge. 2 other things is that I also have a kind of open door policy. My door's not always open. By that, what I mean is that I make clear that my students are welcome to come see me for anything that they need to, that it's not just about my class, my assignments, but I know that some of them are dealing with homelessness, with domestic violence, with immigration issues, and that they can't separate those out and say, oh, that's not part of this class that meets from 8 to 8:50, that their lives are interwoven. And so to me, being a teacher here is that you take your students where you find them, and that web of their lives is something we need to pay attention to and support them. And then I also, though, at the same time, assign readings that I know are really difficult and really long, and my students roll their eyes. But I feel like I also, at the same time, have an obligation to provide them with difficult material, to stimulate, to challenge, and expand their horizons and believe in their capacity to be serious learners. And at the same time, I make a commitment to unpacking those readings in class. So that my motto kind of is, as long as you try to do the reading, I don't care if you don't really understand it at home, we'll go through it. If you still don't understand it, then come see me. Like kind of, so it's a dual commitment to giving them material that's hard, but also working through it really carefully with them. Does it always work? Do they sit there sometimes and roll their eyes, look incredibly bored, just miss the boat completely, and it should have been for a graduate seminar? Yeah. And that's the humbling part of this. I mean, probably everyone, hopefully, it's not just me that's had this experience. And then I say, well, maybe I should deliver by lecture, but it's safer. but that, for me, that's not who I am in the classroom and doesn't work. So anyway, I'm just about done. After I put all of this together, I showed it to my husband, and he's like, yeah, it's all really good, but like, sir, where are the students in it? Where are their lives? And so it made me that, that I'm engaged with. And so because it's limited in time, and it did make me think, though. And so I thought, it made me then think, and this is sort of the end, is I thought back on a few of the letters that students shared with me that they wrote for this, and letters that I've gotten over the years. And I think that the sort of theme for me that's been most gratifying is students who write and say, I came here, I didn't think I was smart, I didn't think I belonged in college, I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. My parents have no idea why I'm in college or why I'm studying, let alone economics, women's gender and sexuality studies. And that to sort of have them say that having a professor see their potential, nurture them, believe in their capacity, really changed their life, gave them a sense of voice and ownership, and that I've played a role in this journey for these amazing students who are now public interest lawyers advocating for victims of violence, social workers working with immigrant communities, one of our latest graduates, a global activist who's diffusing landmines in post-conflict settings. But these are, to note that I've been part of this journey for students who have found their voice here at this university and are living out dreams they were never sure they could pursue. So thank you very much.
So this is probably the first and the last time you'll ever see Paul and I speaking from a script.
That's right.
But we wanted to make sure we got it all in the time.
Yeah, without a lot of scary slides of flooding.
Yeah, that's right.
So first of all, Ellen and I can certainly relate to the two previous speakers' comments. They're very inspiring and insightful, so we appreciate them. Also, we thank our colleagues for this great award. And so the original title of this thing was talking about, the realities of climate change in Boston. But it's really more a story about our collaboration, how we work together on dealing with this difficult problem.
Okay. So this all began with the PhD in Environmental Sciences, the first doctoral program at UMass Boston that was created to address the research on the cleanup of the Boston Harbor. So environmental research at UMass Boston really started with the aim to protect the harbor from Boston. Today, we're working on ways to protect communities from sea level rise and flooding. So research at UMass Boston is now working to protect Boston from the harbor. Paul and I began working together in 2006 on a report sponsored by the Union of Concerned Scientists looking at impacts of climate change across the Northeast.
Yeah, I needed some help on statistics. So I knew Ellen when she was a PhD student at Tufts.
Statistics are us.
Yep, so I immediately called her up, and the rest is history. And right after we did this report for the Union of Concerned Scientists, we started working with the Boston Harbor Association, Massport, Mass DOT, Mass Coastal Zone Management, Boston Water and Sewer Commission, City of Cambridge, to help them find solutions to their climate change problems. This work ultimately led to the formation of the Boston Research Advisory Group, known as the BRAG, that outlined climate impacts specific to Boston in 2016. Overall, we've completed around 12 contracts and grants related to climate change management, and our work continues with at least 3 new contracts funded by the Bar Stone and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And this is what we've learned.
So sadly, the story never gets better as we learn more about the impacts of climate change. For instance, in 2007, the UCS report stated that the number of days over 90 degrees could be as many as 60, or about 2 months, by 2100. In 2016, the Bragg report projected as many as 90 days over 90 degrees, or an entire summer, was possible by 2100. In 2007, 2 meters of sea level rise was plausible, but not probable. In 2016, many scientists are projecting more than 2 meters of sea level rise by 2100. The devastating storms of last January and March validate the importance and the timeliness of the Bragg results and the other research that we and others are doing. Other impacts like climate change, like the impacts of climate change and how they affect hurricanes and nor'easters, or just how frequent intense rainstorms will become, still have a lot of uncertainty and require more research.
As Ellen has described, Boston faces threats from coastal flooding, extreme temperature, and extreme precipitation. As an example, I just want to describe some of the consequences of higher sea levels and more coastal flooding. So for example, as early as 2070, Boston might face $1.4 billion a year in annual losses from coastal flooding. Every year that could be the loss, as early as 2070. By early as 2070, 88,000 people, approximately 15% of Boston's present population, would be exposed to this 100-year flood. Particularly the neighborhoods of South Boston, downtown, East Boston, and Charlestown, where over half of their land area could be flooded. These are some of the most socially vulnerable neighborhoods in East Boston, where in addition, residents may not be able to get to work or have ready access to food and medical care. These populations will not only face economic losses, but also public health impacts due to drowning, contaminant releases, and also mold building up in their buildings after flooding and other threats. Now, many of these can be mitigated by controlling the emissions of greenhouse gases, and the city can seem to implement some of the strategies that we have suggested to manage the flooding. Most recently, such as following our recommendation of using shore-based solutions to manage flooding instead of building a large, expensive barrier around Boston Harbor.
Thank God they listened, huh?
Yeah.
So Paul and I have worked hard to address these issues in Boston and Massachusetts and beyond, but we haven't done this alone. We've been lucky to have really great collaborators and supporters. Chris Watson, our GIS and mapping guru, who's been with us right from the beginning.
UMass graduate.
Yeah, a UMass graduate. Erica Spanger-Siegfried of UCS, Kirk Bosma of Woods Hole Group. Kirk said he might be here. Robin Hannigan, Dean of School for the Environment. Yay. Vivian Lee of the Boston Harbor Association, Steve Miller of Mass DOT, Carl Spector of the City of Boston, and Bud Riss of the Barr Foundation, just to name a few. The UMass Boston School for the Environment, the Sustainable Solutions Lab, and the Urban Harbors Institute have been great partners as well. We've been very fortunate to work at an institution that puts a high value on solving the people's problems.
Yeah, this just goes to show that two hardworking professors working with a great support environment can really make a difference.
And we're lucky to be working in a community that takes our results seriously and turns those results into action.
Thank you very much.